Tony. New technologies you talked about. The question is whether they are strictly genetic modification. The line seems to have been blurred between traditional breeding practices and GM. Cisgenics, is that one of the techniques? Is that how you say it?
That's one option.
So this is what you're doing with the ryegrass, right?
No, we're not doing it with ryegrass.
What are you doing with ryegrass?
We are engineering ryegrass with a changed energy source in the plant to move it from a product of photosynthesis being sugars and carbohydrates to products of lipids.
Yeah, but how are you doing that?
By inserting synthetic genes in to change the biosynthesis of lipids in the plants and components of storage bodies that'll encapsulate those lipids and prevent the plant from breaking them down.
Synthetic genes.
Synthetic genes.
So this is clearly genetic modification.
Absolutely.
What's cisgenics?
Cisgenics comes under a range of terms, and that's an approach where you don't need to introduce essentially DNA from another species. You can actually work with the DNA within the species to engineer itself by just rearranging DNA fragments within the plant.
Right. So technically, you're thinking that might be less than genetic modification.
Well, it's coming to the situation of perception. The technology is the same. The safety and the risk is identical. It's just the perception, and if the public are concerned about GM transferring genes between species or between animals and plants, it's a way of presenting the technology where that doesn't happen.
Let's talk about the ryegrass research then. The genes to import the higher oil content and the gene to help the protein to be digested more easily?
That's with our condensed tannins, to present condensed tannins in forage.
Why can't you do that by traditional breeding methods?
Because the genes you need are not available in the germplasm of the species or even the genus at the moment. In the case of the condensed tannins in clover, we do have genes in a different species, but they are way opposite side of the clade of trifolium, and they cannot be crossed with white clover, for example.
All right, so you're having to squish these things together by force, essentially.
Essentially, although the more we learn about the trait, it's becoming increasingly possible to do it through a cisgenic approach, possibly in the future.
Given that what happened in 2012, when a scientist at Ag Research in Palmerston North allegedly allowed GM ryegrass plants to flower and potentially proliferate, why do you think that GM crops pose no environmental risks?
Well, there's a difference between risk and following regulations, and what is legal and what is not legal.
You mean that was a rogue event because the regulations weren't followed?
That's right.
But surely the point is that if you didn't have the GM crops in the first place, the danger wouldn't be there. You're always going to have the risk of rogue.
With our current regulations, yes, that's always a risk.
How would you describe that risk? How would you describe the risk of your GM ryegrass spreading its pollen outside the contained area?
In terms of physical risk to the environment or wherever, I would say it's basically nil, but it's the risk around following the regulator. It's a legal risk, and it's actually crossing the line of what is legally allowed.
And the reason it's not legally allowed
is our regulations on GM in this country.
And the reason that we have those regulations on GM in this country?
Because there's a perceived that it's a risk. So it's a circular argument.
So there is no risk?
Generically with the technology, I would say there is no risk about the adoption of the technology. That is not to say that I couldn't design something that was very risky and carry it out.
So the regulations are important?
Well, I think if I wanted
to stop you designing something that's very risky.
You could say that, but if I had the aspiration of doing that, I wouldn't use GM. I'd use traditional breeding. I'd have far more chance of getting away with it.
But you couldn't.
Oh, I certainly could.
What could you design that was really dangerous by traditional breeding?
You've only got to look at what traditional breeding's produced in the past and had to be withdrawn from the market. And I go back to my days with potatoes. Breeding for the insect resistance in potatoes resulted in the massive production of
Not
glycoalkaloids.
GM,
Not
just
GM,
ordinary
traditional
breeding.
Ordinary breeding. Cod had to be withdrawn from the market because of increased alkaloids in the tubers. That's a huge safety issue. The same with crossing celery to a wild species and bringing in allergens. When the pickers were picking the celery, they came out in rashes down their arms because of the hairs on the leaves producing toxins against the insects that it was bred for. So traditional breeding can be just as dangerous if you want to look at it in the right perspective.
Rob, who got the standing ovation, I'm exaggerating now, for your question of who controls genetic technology. Now, after the applause, you went on to say that that seems to underscore the need to pursue that technology here, to stop it being controlled and imposed on us by others, or am I making that bit up?
I think the point I'm trying to make is that we could turn our back on genetic technology, but not everyone's going to do that. And particularly people who stand to make money out of it aren't going to do it. So do we really want the only people doing it to be the people who are doing it for the reason of making money? So I'm quite angry with some of these corporations for essentially spoiling what could be the kinds of technologies that could solve some of our most pressing problems.
In what way have they spoilt it?
Well, they've turned people against it. All
Yes.
the people that clapped when I said what I said, I suspect didn't like what I said immediately afterwards.
let's move away from perception and PR. You know, what exactly have they done to turn people against it? I mean, according to John, yields are up. What's so dreadful about that?
I think it's the kinds of technologies that are expressly designed to make money. So things like Roundup Ready crops, which are designed to sell herbicides. That's why they exist. They're not designed to solve any real human need or environmental problem. So it's really the motivation behind developing these technologies that I see as the problem, and lots of other people see that as the problem. Now, the problem with that is we now can't use those technologies to solve human problems because of all of the anti-GE feeling that that's created.
Do you think that it is a thing that will pass, given the number of foodstuffs that contain GM materials that New Zealanders eat, given the number of people wearing GM cotton? It will become a slow erosion until people will go, well, what the hell? Don't you feel that?
I mean, to be honest, I don't know. I think if that's going to happen, it's going to take a very long time, because people have very deeply, strongly held political views against corporations that have done these things, and that's spilled over into how they see genetic engineering as a tool.
And it kind of comes back to the problem that I identified before, that people do not perceive that GMOs are being created for the benefit of anybody except the shareholders of a particular company.
I think that's exactly right.
All right. As a matter of interest, you said GMOs are potentially part of the solution to our environmental problems. Specifically, how?
Well, one way is by increasing agricultural yield on a piece of land of a certain size using GM that allows us to set aside other land for biodiversity.
That, strikes me as such a naive idea. You think a farmer is going to say, oh my God, I've increased my yield in this paddock by a third. That will give me the opportunity to fence off that other paddock and restore it to native bush.
No, that's not what I meant at all.
What do you mean?
I'm talking about the land that is currently marginal land that could potentially be grown on if food problems got so bad that there wasn't anywhere else to grow the food. So let's use the land that's now in agricultural production more efficiently, and if it takes GE crops to do that, I say let's do that. There are other ways of improving efficiency, and we should be doing all those things as
But
well.
specifically, I mean, with, you know, decades of research into genetically modified crops, have useful genetically modified crops been created to be grown on that kind of marginal land usefully?
Well, I suspect not so much, because the people who've been doing the genetic technology, that's not the reason they've been doing it. They've been doing it to sell products to farmers and make money for their shareholders.
See, I mean, I think the thing that really gets up people's noses is that the promises of higher yield and environmental protection and less pesticides and drought resistance and feeding the hungry have all been made by the people who seem to have made no effort to do any of that. Am I right or not?
I agree with you, yes. I mean, they never really had that. That was not their motivation. Their motivation was to make money. They
And
said
all the
those
rest
things
is a
to
PR smokescreen.
Exactly, and that's now ruined it for the promise that GE may have for actually solving some of our problems.
Richard.
Help me, Kim.
What do you think about that? We've been sold a pup.
I think it was one of the worst PR exercises. To be honest, you couldn't have done it worse if you'd done it by design. So in some sense, I agree that the whole release of genetic modified crops was got blurred with the sort of anti-big business sentiment that came through. So now we're in the situation where, as we've seen already tonight, that the GM debate is completely intertwined with the corporations controlling food debate.
I was hoping you might.
Sector's choice.
I was hoping you might go on for a while.
Okay, well, I will go on for a while then. I think what's quite nice about the fact that we still haven't decided whether we're going to be GE free or use GM technologies in New Zealand. We've been sitting on the fence for so long. Is that while we've been sitting on the fence, the clock's been ticking, and actually a lot of these patents that allow the big corporations to control these technologies are actually going to be coming off patent soon. So it's like a pharmaceutical drug comes off patent, becomes a generic.
No, but you know what they do, Richard. This is what they'll do. They'll tweak a bit of it, and they'll recycle it as a whole new thing, thereby extending the patent.
Sure, they'll do that, and but there's still an opening there. I mean, the same thing happens with drugs. That happens. There's a bit of tweaking going on, but it still gives the door opens to producing generics, if you like.
You know, given that the government has a target of increasing the value of New Zealand food exports from I think I had this right, from $25 billion to $60 billion a year, is that possible without GM?
Actually, we were debating this the other day with the Ministry of Primary Industries. It looks as though we're actually going to hit that target by doing very little, because food's become such a high value commodity in the world. And in fact, the problem is actually making sure no disasters happen. So it's become an argument about protection. We need to make sure that we don't have another major biosecurity incursion, or we don't have a big sustainability disaster, to make sure that we do hit that target. So we're going to hit it anyway, probably.
We haven't really addressed, I'll address it with you. Philip talked about it. The advantage, the monetary advantage, the export advantage to New Zealand being GM free. How do you rate that?
I don't know. We'd have to go and ask all the industries. But if all the industries actually don't put it up front there and they just hide it behind, there wouldn't be much value add if they could, to find.
That's right. If you could shout about it for a while, Philip, and then we'll work out what it's worth. Is that what you mean?
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.